Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Let's get started. Good afternoon. Um, Anybody dealing with too many access requests or access reviews around? Or is it a lame question to ask? I think it's one of those problems that need to be addressed, in a different way when you think about it. We have a lot of focus being made on how to provide more bells and whistles around the request system, or how to provide a lot of hooks to perform access reviews. Has been less emphasis on actually bringing down the number of requests or bringing down the number of reviews that people should do. It's not like requests will go away or reviews will go away. There is a place for that. But I think when you look at how people look at it, they tend to think, requests should have these capabilities, these options, or reviews should have these additional options, and for configuration and build and so on. It's a strange way, that you're pushing the vendor to add more capabilities around that versus asking, tell me how I can do less of that, right? Policies are, think of it as an instrument to facilitate some of that. There is one approach to manage that velocity, if you will, right? So I'm Sanjay Nadimpalli, and I'm CEO of Tuebora. Today we're going to talk about why a policy-based system would give better outcomes for your organization. So if you think about it, what this is representing is in the world where you don't have any policies, largely the activities are surrounded through access requests, and then you bring in policies into the system. The requests will start kind of tapering down, and you'll have more and more access that is granted through policies. And the graph, although ideally sort of represents a model where roughly between 70 to 80% you kind of optimize with regard to policy-based access for multiple reasons. People would sort of get into this policy fatigue, if you will, because all good things must find some pinnacle, right? Policies also have a point where you'll see some of that, and then there is this out of policy access which is necessary for running the business. It's not that everything can be constrained or modeled through a particular policy because of the needs of the business, for a variety of reasons, for delegation, for circumstances, and you can't really have policy for every access that is out there either, right? So it has to be effective in terms of its coverage and how it is good. So it's represented over a period of time, and that's what it's going to look like for organizations practically when you start thinking about it. And that's where the risk profile also tends to operate in the same way. So before we get into what a policy should look like, it's good to spend some time in terms of the data model itself. So what you see there is kind of a separation between the IT layer and the business layer. So what does this exactly mean? So typically you will see an IT system, you have accounts, and you have resources in the IT system, and what you get is typical permissions from that. And then identities will have one or more accounts in IT systems, and typically the engagement is such that you will have some representation going from the entitlement into permissions of the IT systems. And that modeling is by its very nature is a function of what we call as an application. Every application represents entitlements in a certain way, and they inherently translate to some permissions on the IT system side. So the real issue will come in when you start seeing policies driven when they're driven largely from the business layer. You'll see better outcomes, and there are some things to consider on the IT layer as well in the process. So the set of relationships that you are seeing here is if you take a concrete example, you take Azure Active Directory. It's a directory that manages resources in the IT environment, and you have a set of applications built on top of that. So you think of Office, you think of SharePoint, you think of Teams, bunch of those applications that are built on top of that, and they have certain entitlements represented, right? And they in turn will map into specific permissions on the IT system. So we clearly need to understand the difference between the two. Otherwise, what would happen is a lot of times the problem arises when people try to bundle something here with something there, and the data model itself will become cumbersome in terms of how you look at policies. So it's important to make that particular distinction out there. So the reality is the application is a representation of a set of entitlements, and entitlements are in turn representation of certain permissions, and those permissions have given to certain IT systems. Now the consideration here is that we will have some policies even on the IT layer as well. The example is you will have some requirements or definitions to say accounts should be named in a certain way. It is the simple example, right? Policy is not necessarily representative of risk per se, but it is also how it is going to be governed. So you will have some policies that define at the IT level as well, and then you have certain policies that would come in at the entitlement level. So it is again some of the pieces surrounding entitlement policies could be specific to the entitlement, or it could be inherited from the application itself. So people would have policies that are defined at the application level, and policies that get defined at the entitlement level, and also at the account level. And when you're modeling this, it's important to also call out that the policies at the IT system level are not things that are visible to the business. It is something that is inherently managed, not necessarily something that is made visible to the business. And the stakeholders and people who are going to manage the life cycle or the review process for that will be different. Large part of the conversation is mostly around application level and entitlement level policies, and who are the personas who are going to manage that. So talking about personas, if you look at an organization, let's evaluate who are the right set of people who will be good candidates for managing policies. So when organizations think about policies, they are largely talking about managing access risk and performing timely actions with regard to managing risk. So if you don't find the right people for managing, it can become an issue over a period of time. And how do you go about figuring out what a policy is? In Tuebora we call it as policy mining, and policy mining is something that is driven and managed through a process of discovery. So you have learning and clustering algorithms that determine patterns of access, and that's how you would identify. So let's start with the manager here. And if you look at the manager, this person has visibility into what her team, in this case Mark, his team, and they have a good idea of his team and the requirement there. Mark does not have enough visibility into how the overall application risk profile is going to be managed. So in a way it's a bit fragmented for Mark's role, in terms of looking at a policy or even taking a decision on the policy. And then on the other side, you have on the far right you have a person who is closely associated with IT system. They are largely focused on the IT side of things, like we talked about, overwhelmed with how the system is managed in its own way, and with no visibility into the business. So for example, in the Azure AD example I gave, so what does a particular group mean and how it should be managed is not something that Dexter would know, and Dexter would not know even the risk associated with granting permissions to that particular group, as an example. So Dexter also does not come out as the ideal candidate for managing policies. So when you look at who would probably make an ideal candidate for this, it would be an application owner, because she represents the risk profile and management of that risk profile, and she has a better visibility into the usage of the application, and also the profile of the users to whom access should be granted. Having said this, governance is not something that is going to be driven or done by individuals. It has to be a group activity. So it is, it should not be construed as, okay, policies for my application are completely going to be, defined or managed through, by an application owner. But largely the responsibility will rely on the, policy, on the application owner. So let's take a few scenarios here and see how this maps out. So in this example, we have a bunch of identities, and currently there are no policies in the system, and the entitlement is being managed through request process. So every access that has been granted in this scenario, the basic or simple scenario, is through a request process. So all three identities have been given that entitlement through a request process. So there is really no leverage of the entitlement in this model. If you take an example where you would start mining and seeing a pattern, so you could get into a situation where the pattern has been established for a couple of identities, and we've been able to figure out policies for those, and at that point those would not be request driven anymore. They're going to be policy driven. Suddenly, because of your policy mining exercise, you got very high coverage in terms of the entitlement grants in this environment. So we went from 0 with no policy mining, found some patterns, and we are able to establish that this can be driven through policy. Now, if you go a step further and you say that we have going to get a bit greedy here and say, let's try to find a mechanism or a model for identify for it to get this entitlement. Maybe there is no pattern here, or maybe there is a pattern, and the policy engine comes back and says, okay, let's try to see and define a policy for it, and we will evaluate its efficacy and what it does to the system. So at this point, you went from 2/3 having been given access through a policy, and also going into a coverage model where it is going up to 75%. So out of the 4 people who had a need for this access, now we've got 3 of them done and granted through a policy model, and this is largely driven by you seeing a pattern first, and then that's an easy use case, and then subsequently you're not seeing a pattern, but you establish that it is okay to grant this. So there is things like something should be given based on the pattern. There are things about something can be given, right? Everything is not about an access that you give. So identity 5 is largely a good candidate for this is an access or an entitlement that could be given to an individual. Now, extending this further, if you see identity 1 and identity 2, now we haven't found any pattern, and not just that, we have also determined that there can't be any policy associated with it, just for the reasons that they are not good candidates for this. So you went from no policies to higher degree of coverage, and as you went through the exercise of providing or granting access through request system, your coverage kind of came down, right? So this is sort of the trend you will see in an enterprise. When you go through this request process and the velocity increases, your mining gets better, you'll find patterns, you'll get higher coverage, and then suddenly you'll find scenarios where the coverage kind of drops, and you can't really bring in policy there, and that's something to be aware of as you are determining the policy based access. So what does it mean for an auditor when you look at something like this, right? So what does it mean for an auditor when you look at something like this? So auditors are going to look at 2 things. One is what policies you have and how are things operated with those policies. They are also interested in what are you doing with out of policy access, what actions are you taking there, right? So if you notice, most of the time people do these access reviews because there is some audit that is going to happen, or they need to provide some evidence and data. And the thought process here is anything that is not covered by policy has to be clearly identified as what are you doing procedurally to control that particular access. You need to provide that piece of information, and also you need to demonstrate that you are doing periodic certification of that particular access. Those are a must-have for an auditor, right? And then the ones that are covered by policy, you need to also determine what is the mechanism through which the policies are being managed, and also how are they going to be enforced. Because it's just not about discovering a policy, enforcement also becomes key, right? Because you established it as a process, enforcement, so there needs to be evidence that it is being enforced, right? There is data that needs to be given. And how often are you reviewing this? That is also a piece of data that you will have to provide. And then for the auditor, what they will do is they will actually sample these. They will randomly pick policies. They'll pick applications and entitlements and say, show me evidence that things are in order with particular entitlements and so on. So what does the process actually look like? When you start the initial state, you had nothing, right? There's no categorization of anything. So you do a discovery through a mining process. We use several self-learning ML mechanisms to mine these policies, and then you kind of get two categories, right? You have policy-based access, out-of-policy access, and you also identify under access too, because there is a policy which says access should be given, but today it is not given. So what do you do with that? It's important to address that, because if you don't address that, you end up having to go through a request process for that. So you can proactively manage under access, in this model, right? It is just not about certifying something or approving something. You are also, when you look at under access and manage it, through policy based, you can proactively address that. And in the review, you can categorize it. If it is a policy based access, take a call on, is this a should have, or is it a can have, or is it a should not have? So you as a policy reviewer, you have the option to categorize this, and you flag it, right? And then something that is should not have, and also under access also will have to be managed during the, this step during the review. And ultimately all of these actions will undergo fulfillment, right? So you would do deprovisioning wherever it is an anomaly. You will provision wherever there is under access, and it becomes a kind of a continuous process. So this is a continuous ongoing process. As and when you see access changes, you will need to trigger this. You can determine certain applications undergo this process on a weekly basis, certain applications on a different time frame. You can do it on demand as well. You can go and say, I want to pick this access and I want you to tell me mine policies for this. So on demand exercise is also going to be valuable. Last but not least, the way this we want to deal with is go with certain recommendations here, right? The recommendations are understand the difference between the business side of things and the IT side of things, because both will have policies. It is just not about your application and entitlements, right? And then use policies to reduce your administrative burden. So as you see, you're not just talking about reduction in requests, but you're also talking about reduction in what you're going to review, right? You review policies and you review out of policy access, as opposed to reviewing tens and thousands of entitlements, where it typically brings out the burden for the enterprise. And then review these policies. Just like everything else, you talk about periodic access reviews, you want to review policies as well, and effectively reduce these certifications of policy-based access. So if there is a request that comes in, you have the option to say, if it's a policy-based access, go and do the fulfillment. You don't have to wait for any particular approval. So you can reduce that change. So that would be the recommendation for us, as an enterprise, to be able to say the objective should be clear: reduction in requests and reduce the burden of reviews. And through a system, it is not a one-time process, a continuous process where you are refining your policies. So that's it from my side. Happy to answer any questions or even do a demonstration of that if anybody is interested. Yeah.
What happens if somebody falls outside the policy but needs the access? Because what we do is we have policy base and we let people request the access outside of the policy, and then they get certified corporately while the policy gets certified in. Is that right?
Yes. So it is a common use case, what you're talking about, where it becomes an exception, right? But what you will see is, if if you see too many of those requests over a period of time, you will end up seeing a pattern potentially too, right? If it's a one-off, it's okay to review that. But sometimes you end up seeing a pattern and that becomes potentially new policy, right? It's rarely that you'll see too many exceptions. Not that it can't happen, but it's a rare phenomena. But that's why it's not a one-time activity, but it's a continuous process, right? Yeah. Any other question? Okay. Thank you.